The Letters of a Post-Impressionist by Vincent Van Gogh. Translated by Anthony Mario Ludovici. Section 2. Introductory Essay, Part 2. A vast and unprecedented revolution has been convulsing the art world for almost a century now. A revolution in which men like Gauguin, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Rodin, and others have fought like Titans. Who has ever heard of a revolution enduring for almost a century? Even the Grand Rebellion lasted only for 6 years. And this revolution of art has seen its heroes and its traitors, its kings and its usurpers, its romance and its squalor, all beneath the very nose of the layman, all beneath the very walls of his fool's paradise, without his ever having suspected that something even significant was brewing. For art is always the expression of the most sensitive men of an age. They, the artists, are the first, by their movements and by the manner in which they garner their treasure, to prophesy meteorological changes of a nature vast enough to shake even the layman into a state of gasping wonder. But, as a rule, it is only when these highly sensitive men have manifested their signs, and have more or less depicted the first lightning flash of the tempest that is imminent, that the sky really does become dark and overcast, patently overcast even to the layman's eyes, and that the storm which they felt was coming actually begins to rage in the concrete world of politics and of national life. And then the pictures, poems, and parables, already stored away, classified and catalogued in public museums, are but the crystallized harbingers of a fact that has become patent to all. The general truth that nearly all the principal figures in this grand rebellion drama were themselves innovators, renovators, and subverters, does not in itself justify us in summarily disposing of them as noisy revolutionaries and nothing more. One can revolt against sickness in an age of sickness, and assume the title of a revolutionary or a rebel with both pride and dignity. On the other hand, a resentful valetudinarian, who feels rebellious at the sight of sleek, fragrant, and rosy healthiness, may also claim the title revolutionary. But woe then to the age that allows itself to be lured over to his side by his intellect and his art. It is important, therefore, that we should know with whom we are dealing. We are aware that in the majority of cases all the noise of this art revolution has been concentrated around questions of technique. The purpose of art was tacitly assumed to be to obtain as faithful a transcript as possible of nature and of reality, pure and simple. Not nature linked up with a higher idea, or reality bathed in the atmosphere of a love that transcended mere actualities, but simply nature and reality as they were felt by anybody and everybody. And the milestones along the highway, covered by this revolutionary band, do not mark the acquisition of new passions or new loves, but rather the adoption of new technical methods and mannerisms for accomplishing this transcript in ever more perfect and more scientific ways. Nature with its light and its atmospheric effects roused men like Manet and his friends to heroic deeds of determination. Peasants, innocent and unsophisticated, seemingly belonging to nature and not to town or artificial life, were included in the category nature, from which it was legitimate to make a transcript. Café scenes, scenes of town life, glimpses behind the scenes, were included in the category reality, provided their artificiality and unnaturalness were mitigated by a certain character, of which it was also legitimate to make a transcript. And all this was done, not because the peasant or the scenes from town life were linked up with any higher purpose or any definite scheme of life which happened to fire the hearts of the painters of last century, but because, as a matter of fact, all life passions, all life schemes were at an end, and anything was good enough, picturesque enough, trivial enough for these artists, whose general skepticism drove them to technique as the only refuge. to tackle and to try their new technique, their new method, or new watchword upon. Light, the play of complementaries, the breaking up of light, the study of values, little things please little minds. It was these preoccupations that usurped the place of the rapidly vanishing subject in pictures. But what was the subject? What part had it played? It is true that the subject picture at Manet's time was rapidly becoming a mere farce, an empty page filled arbitrarily with any sentiment or mood that happened to be sufficiently puerile, or at least sufficiently popular. But it had had a noble past. It had had a royal youth. The subject picture was merely the survival of an age when men had painted with a deep faith. It was the last vestige of an historical period in which men had been inspired to express their relationship to life by something higher and greater than both themselves and their art. In fact, it had always flourished in periods when humanity had known of a general direction, a general purpose in life, and of a scheme of life which gave their heartbeats and their breath some deeper meaning than they have at present. The degeneration of the subject picture, then, into a mere illustration of some passing event or ephemeral sentiment, had a deeper significance than even its bitterest enemies recognized. For a while they, as new technicians, seeking light in complementaries and values, deplored the spiritless and uninspired oleographs of their academical contemporaries. They completely overlooked the deeper truth. Their artistic instincts were not strong enough to make them see that the spiritless and uninspired subject picture was the most poignant proof that could be found of the fact that mankind no longer possessed, to any passionate or intense degree, that which made the subject picture possible. That is to say, a profound faith in something greater and more vital either than the artists themselves or their art, something which gave not only art but also life a meaning and a purpose. This, as I have pointed out elsewhere, was the great oversight of the revolutionary movement in art of the second half of the 19th century. In abusing the degenerate subject picture, these innovators were simply inveighing against a pathological symptom. In saying the subject did not matter, they deliberately scouted the responsibility of eradicating or even of confronting the evil, while in concentrating upon technique, and in finding their inspiration in such secondary matters as the treatment of light, values, and complementaries, besides revealing the poverty of their artistic instincts, they merely delayed the awakening which was bound to come, and which already today is not so very far distant. The awakening to the fact that the artist, the architect, the painter, the poet, and the preacher are bankrupt unless some higher purpose and direction, some universal aim and aspiration, animate their age, inspire them in their work, and kindle in them that necessary passion for a particular type of man, on which they may lavish their eloquence, their chromatic, musical, architectural, or religious rhetoric with conviction, power, and faith. Where does Van Gogh stand in this revolutionary drama, which I have attempted briefly to sketch in the above lines? Without esteeming him nearly so highly as many of his most enthusiastic admirers do, and without sharing in the least in that hysterical exaggeration of the value and beauty of his works, which has characterized the attitude of large numbers of his followers on the continent, an exaggeration which, as I shall show, he would have been the first to deprecate and to condemn, I must still confess that, as an Impressionist, a revolutionary of the 80s, who, to my mind, strove to surpass Impressionism, as also so-called Post-Impressionism, he is a painter for whom I feel a much greater respect than I can feel for Manet, Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Whistler. Let me make it quite plain that I realize the superiority in some respects of the latter's art forms. Let me emphasize the fact that in my opinion Van Gogh was by no means so mature in his procedure as any one of these artists. safe perhaps in so far as his drawing far excelled Renoir's, but that his aims were higher and more vital, that he realized more keenly what was wrong and what was desirable, that he was 1,000 times more profound than his predecessors. Of all these things, after careful consideration, and I must admit grave doubts, I have at last grown quite convinced. Before proceeding with my argument, let me lay stress on the point that I feel very little sympathy whatever with any of these Impressionists, art form maniacs, and their followers inasmuch as they obscured the issues at the very moment, halfway through the last century, when the issues were growing so plain that they must have found a solution sooner or later. But if we are going to speak of preferences, if in a gingerly manner we are going to put on gloves and draw out from among this crowd the men whom we feel we can tolerate most readily, then from the sculptor Rodin to his friend Renoir, of all of the names that are now household words in the Impressionistic and Post-Impressionistic movement of the late 19th century, I for my part certainly select Van Gogh, and perhaps a little way before him his friend Gauguin, as the only two whom I can contemplate with equanimity, not to speak of approval. In judging Van Gogh, one of the critic's greatest difficulties is, in the first place, to see a sufficient number of his pictures. For he passed through so many phases that isolated examples of his work may prove merely misleading. Now, thanks to the Post-Impressionist exhibition of 1910 and 1911 in London, the Sonderbund Ausstellung in Cologne, 1912, and a visit to Amsterdam, I have been able to see about 200 of Van Gogh's paintings, and about a quarter as many drawings. But when one remembers that the largest exhibition of his work which has ever been held contains some 450 pictures alone, not to speak of drawings, it will be seen that to be acquainted with 200 of his works is a long way from possessing a complete knowledge of what he achieved. Still, the specimens I have seen I believe to have been thoroughly representative, and in any case sufficient to warrant my forming an opinion as to his merits. Van Gogh died when he was only 37 years of age, and Émile Bernard reminds us that though he always used to draw, he really did not give his attention wholly to painting until the year 1882, that is to say, when he was fully 29 years old. About this time he writes to his brother, "In a sense I am glad that I never learned to paint. I really do not know how to paint. Armed with a white panel, I take up a position in front of the spot that interests me, contemplate what lies before me, and say to myself, that white panel must be turned into something." Concerning two studies finished at this period, he says, "I feel quite certain that on looking at these two pictures, no one will ever believe that they are the first studies I have ever painted." It is true that in the early 80s he studied a little with Mauve, who was a distant relative, and later on spent some time at the Academy at Antwerp. But on the whole, like Gauguin, he was self-taught, and when we reckon the number of years during which this self-tuition lasted, we can but be amazed at the result, and believe him when he says that painting was in his very marrow. A still more remarkable fact about Van Gogh is, however, that during the last 8 years of his life, the only years, that is to say, in which he may really be said to have devoted himself entirely to painting, whether at The Hague, Drenthe, Nouenen, Antwerp, Paris, Arles, Saint Remy, or Auvers-sur-Oise, he practically epitomized in his own work the whole of the development of modern painting, from the academical manner of his own day to a style which I maintain was on the point of bearing him far beyond the Impressionists and so-called Post-Impressionists. When I say far beyond the Impressionists and so-called Post-Impressionists, I do not mean it in the accepted sense of this phrase. I do not mean that with Gauguin he promised to land in any of the futile absurdities with which those artists that were hung beside them provoked the mirth of London at the famous exhibition at the Grafton Galleries in 1910 to 1911. I mean it in this case as something peculiar to Van Gogh and Gauguin alone, something which I shall explain in due course, and which I regard as valuable and worthy of a more sound artistic instinct than that possessed by all of their contemporaries. I have myself seen pictures which I could not help thinking must have been painted in Van Gogh's academic period. Meyer Graef even thinks that Van Gogh's work of this period is likely to rise in public esteem. I have little doubt, therefore, that Van Gogh did go through an academic stage, however short and however undistinguished it may have been. And as for his purely impressionistic period, pictures of this stage of his development abound. The Moulin de la Galette and a still life, basket and apples, in the possession of a Frau A.G. Kroller, the view of Paris from Montmartre, belonging probably to the family, and the wonderful Apples in a Basket, dedicated to his friend Lucien Pizarro, in the possession of Frau Kroller, seem to belong to this period, and they are by no means incompetent or unworthy examples of the school of which they are examples. At this stage he had the same contempt as all modernists had for academicians, and we find him endorsing Jacques' words that they are mere illustrators. It is now that he feels that light and truth and transcripts of nature matter tremendously. He says he is done with greys, and with mauve and Israels as well. He enters heart and soul into a study of nature. No pains are too great, no sacrifices too heavy, provided only that he may become absorbed in nature and thoroughly at ease as her interpreter. Possessed as he was of a remarkable gift of observation, nature fortunately did not take long to tell him all that she has to tell the truly instinctive artist. For a man who could paint that still life Apples in a Basket, dedicated to Pizarro, and the still life, a statuette, a rose, and books, belonging, I believe, to Van Gogh's family, not to speak of dozens of other marvels of observation, such as the chestnut in bloom, belonging to Frau Kroller, in which the essential character of the tree is beautifully seized by the happiest of conventions, would necessarily be a rapid and courageous learner of all that nature can teach, and would soon become conscious of having reached that decisive Rubicon, the imperative crossing of which means one of two alternatives: either the continuation of the old attitude to nature, which at this stage becomes mere slavery and no longer discipleship, or the mastering of nature, which is the first step that reveals the mature artist of sound instincts. Van Gogh writes, "I do not wish to argue studying from nature, or struggling with reality out of existence. For years I myself worked in this way with almost fruitless, and in any case wretched results. I should not like to have avoided this error, however. In any case, I am quite convinced that it would have been sheer foolery on my part to have continued to pursue these methods, although I am not by any means so sure that all my trouble has been in vain." So far, then, Van Gogh's sole excuse, and it is an adequate one, for having concerned himself wholly with such subordinate things as art forms and nature transcripts, is that he was a learner. A time comes, however, when in the case of the mature artist, we must take technical competency for granted, and greybeards, as many of the Impressionist sculptors and painters grew to be, who continue to concentrate upon technical questions and to regard them as ends in themselves, merely reveal the fact that they never were artists at all. In this respect, I cannot help quoting some fine words of Gauguin's. Writing to Charles Maurice in April 1903, he said, "Nous venons de subir en art une très grande période d'égarement causée par la physique, la chimie, la mécanique et l'étude de la nature. Les artistes, ayant perdu toute leur sauvagerie, n'ayant plus d'instinct, on pourrait dire d'imagination, se sont égarés dans tous les sentiers pour trouver des éléments producteurs qui n'avait pas la force de rire. The reader who is familiar with my aesthetic views will understand that I do not regard la physique, la chimie, et la mécanique as sufficient causes of this state of affairs. Nevertheless, Gauguin adds that the painters of this période d'égarement had lost their instincts, and here, of course, I am with him. The fact, however, that a painter or a sculptor has not lost his instincts is not sufficient to reform the civilization or the culture in which he lives. A still greater and more powerful artist must set to work first, and he is the legislator. The most a painter or a sculptor of sound instinct can do is to recognize the lack of the great legislator, and reveal by his work and by the things upon which he concentrates his mind that he realizes where the fault lies. Now I maintain that Van Gogh and Gauguin took up this position, but I am anticipating. Van Gogh passed through another stage before he reached this final one. It suddenly flashed across his mind that he had something to bestow, something to bequeath, and that an artist's life was not all taking, robbing, or copying. He felt a richness in him which bade him dispense and no longer receive. He writes, "One begins by plaguing oneself to no purpose in order to be true to nature, and one concludes by working quietly from one's own palette alone, and then nature is the result." And again, I often feel sorry that I cannot induce myself to work more at home from imagination. Imagination is surely a faculty one should develop. And listen to this: how glad I should be one day to try to paint the starry heavens, as also a vast meadow studded with dandelions in the sunlight. But how can one ever hope to succeed in doing these things, unless one resolves to stay at home and to work from imagination? He also begins to throw off the technique of transcript painting. He recognizes that chiaroscuro, with its essential study of values, is part of the equipment of the mere slavish transcripist, and he writes, "It is impossible to attach the same importance both to values and to colours." Theodore Rousseau understood the mixing of colours better than anyone, but time has blackened his pictures, and now they are unrecognizable. One cannot be at the pole and at the equator at once. One must choose one's way. At least this is what I hope to do, and my way will be the road to colour. And again, tell him, Seurat, it is my most fervent desire to know how to achieve such deviations from reality, such inaccuracies and such transfigurations that come about by chance. Well, yes, if you like, they are lies, but they are more valuable than real values. These are the thoughts of his most prolific period, the period during which he produced perhaps all his most striking pictures, the last 3 years of his life. Such pages of beauty as the orchard in Provence, belonging to Madame Cohen Goschalk-Bonger, a street in Arles, in the possession of the Municipal Museum at Stettin, a street in Auvergne, belonging to A. von Jolensky, Munich, hail from this period, as also the lawn, probably in the possession of the family, a finished masterpiece of beauty, the sunset, belonging to Frau Tilla Duriers Kasserer, excellent, and a number of other landscapes belonging to Frau Kroller, Frau Mauthner, Frau Cohen Goschalk-Bonger, etc., all of great splendour and mastery. The fact that he was never able to work successfully from imagination alone proves nothing against the art of working from imagination. I have heard some artists argue as if their individual incapacity to produce great work from imagination were a sufficient proof of the fallacy of the principle. Such argumentation is, of course, beneath contempt. On such lines any incompetence, impotence, ignorance, or incapacity could be glorified and exalted. Van Gogh, however, is more honest. He says working from imagination is an enchanted land. Although he recognizes the desirability, the superiority of such methods, he feels that he is not good enough for them. He says, "Others may be more gifted for the painting of abstract studies, and you, Bernard, are certainly one of these, as is also Gauguin." And he concludes by saying that when he is older he too may do the same. End of section 2. Recording by Elisabeth Sollog, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.